It's just easier if you don't come. Those 7 words dropped into my ear on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon while I stood in my small kitchen, holding the phone in one hand and a tea towel in the other. I froze as soon as I heard them. The kettle had just clicked off, steam rising into the air, curling against the kitchen window. I remember staring at that little ribbon of steam, my hand trembling slightly and thinking, did she really just say that? My daughter-in-law's voice was calm, almost casual, not sharp, not cruel in tone, but the words themselves carried the weight of a locked door. I knew instantly that something was shifting in my family, and I wasn't being given the chance to hold it steady. I stood there for a few seconds, not answering, letting the silence between us stretch long enough that I could hear her breathing on the other end. She didn't rush to fill the gap. She simply left it there, as though it was perfectly normal to tell me I shouldn't come to dinner. "It's just easier if you don't come," she had said, like the matter was already settled, like I had been the one making things complicated. I wanted to ask, easier for whom? Easier how? But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, all I managed was a weak, "Oh, I see." She said nothing more, just, "We'll talk soon." And then the line went dead. I placed the phone on the counter as though it was something fragile, and I leaned against the sink, my hand still gripping the damp towel. I felt the clock on the wall ticking behind me, each second heavy, pushing me forward into a moment I hadn't expected. You see, family gatherings had never been optional for me. All my life, I was the one who set the table, baked the pies, brought the flowers, made sure everyone felt seen. That was my role. Not because anyone forced it on me, but because I believed family needed anchors, and I was determined to be one. So to hear, so suddenly, that my presence was a burden, that my being there was something that needed to be eliminated to make things easier, struck me like a blow I couldn't dodge. I replayed her sentence in my head over and over, dissecting it as though each word might hold a clue. It's just easier. So there was difficulty when I was included, at least in her eyes. What difficulty? Was I too slow moving around the kitchen, too eager to ask the children questions, too insistent on telling old stories? Was I embarrassing them somehow? If you don't come, not if you can't make it, not if you'd rather not, but a direct exclusion. It was not about my convenience, it was about theirs. And the final sting, she didn't say, "We'd prefer you not to come," or "Could you sit this one out?" She wrapped it in the guise of practicality, like she was doing me a favor by pointing out the obvious. I sank into the chair by the kitchen table, staring at the vase of flowers from last week's market. The tulips were fading, petals folding inward, but they still held on, stubborn in their softness. I thought about the dinner I had been preparing for, how I had already picked out a pie recipe, how I had been planning what dress to wear, how I had even imagined the children's faces when I walked in. All of that vanished in one sentence. I wanted to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps she meant something else, but deep down I knew it wasn't a slip of the tongue. There had been signs before, subtle hints I had ignored. Times when she forgot to include me in group messages about plans, or when she told me the children were too busy to visit. Moments when my son seemed to shrink a little in silence whenever I asked if they wanted me at Sunday lunch. Each time, I told myself not to overthink, not to make waves, to give them space. But this was not a missed message or a forgotten call. This was deliberate, spoken directly, and without apology. I thought back to years earlier when family dinners were joyous chaos, when I was in the kitchen with my sleeves rolled up, my husband beside me, my son carrying trays to the table, laughter echoing down the hall. My daughter-in-law used to smile at me then, thanking me for helping, saying she didn't know how I managed to cook so much. I never imagined that one day she would be the one to tell me I wasn't needed, or worse, that my presence made things harder. Sitting at that table, I felt the urge to pick up the phone again, to call her back and demand an explanation. But then I thought of how the conversation would go. She would deny any cruelty. She would soften her words, say it wasn't meant that way, say I misunderstood. And I would be left questioning myself, doubting my own ears. No, I couldn't put myself through that. I knew what I had heard. The sentence was too sharp, too clear to be twisted into anything else. I got up slowly, my knees stiff, and walked to the freezer. The pie crust I had bought 2 days earlier was sitting there, waiting to be filled with apples and cinnamon. I closed the door on it and told myself I would bake it another time. Then I turned to the flowers I had been saving to bring along as a gift. I pulled them from the wrapping and set them into a vase on my own table. If I wasn't welcome at theirs, then these flowers could brighten my home instead. The rest of that afternoon passed in a haze. I made myself tea, sat in the living room, and tried to focus on a book. But every few minutes, my mind wandered back to those words. It's just easier if you don't come. Easier. As though my existence was a problem to be solved, not a person to be loved. I told myself not to cry, not because I wanted to be strong, but because I didn't want to give her words the satisfaction of pulling tears from me. Instead, I repeated them like a mantra, letting the sting sink in fully, because I knew that pretending it didn't hurt would only bury it deeper, where it could fester. By evening, I had replayed the conversation so many times in my head that I could hear her voice even without the phone. I remembered the exact tone, polite, measured, but utterly final. No anger, no frustration, just the quiet efficiency of someone moving a piece off the board to make the game simpler. That was what unsettled me the most. If she had shouted at me, if there had been an argument, I could have fought back, defended myself. But how do you fight against? It's just easier if you don't come. You can't. You're not even invited into the fight. You're simply erased. I went to bed early that night. Though I didn't sleep much, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house. I thought about my husband, how he would have reacted if he were still alive. He had always been protective of me, never allowing anyone to dismiss me or make me feel small. But now it was just me, navigating this silence, trying to decide what role I had left in a family that suddenly seemed to prefer my absence. That sentence, 7 simple words, didn't just keep me from a dinner. They opened a door to a truth I had been too afraid to face. Maybe I had already been drifting to the edges of their lives, and I just hadn't admitted it. Maybe I had been holding on to traditions and expectations that mattered only to me. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to see what life looked like without waiting for an invitation that might never come. The next morning after that phone call, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table, staring at the quiet house. That silence gave me too much space to think, and when I let myself think, I couldn't ignore the truth. The sentence I had heard hadn't been born overnight. It had roots, deep ones, stretching back years. What I had taken as ordinary family missteps were really signs of something growing, a distance between me and the people I had once believed were my safe harbor. I could trace it back to when my husband passed away. He had been the glue in our gatherings, not because he forced it, but because his presence commanded respect. When he sat at the head of the table, no one dared exclude me. After the funeral, when the casseroles stopped arriving and the condolences turned into brief check-ins, I noticed how quickly my son leaned into his wife's world. It wasn't wrong. He had his own family, his own responsibilities. But where once I was consulted, included, and expected, I began to feel like an afterthought. My invitations to join Sunday lunches were met with hesitation. "We'll see," he often said. Or, "The kids have soccer, maybe another time." Each time I told myself not to be needy, not to push. But when another time rarely came, the truth whispered louder than the excuses. I remembered one afternoon, maybe 2 years after my husband's death. I had bought tickets for a children's theatre show, thinking it would be a fun outing with my grandchildren. I called my son and said, "I'd love to take them Saturday." He paused before answering. "Let me check with her," he said, meaning his wife. Hours later, the call came back. "She thinks it's too much for them right now. Maybe next season." The next season never came. The tickets sat unused on my dresser until they expired, and I told myself not to mind, that at least I had tried. But inside, a small wound opened, not because the children didn't come with me, but because I realized I had no direct say anymore. My plans needed approval, and approval rarely came. There were holidays, too, that revealed the shift. One Christmas, I arrived with carefully wrapped gifts, ribbons tied with the same care I had once given to my son's own childhood presents. When I walked in, I felt the hesitation in the air. My daughter-in-law said quickly, "Oh, we told everyone this year we'd keep it simple, no big gifts." She smiled, but her eyes told me I had broken a rule I hadn't been informed about. The gifts sat awkwardly under the tree, and when the paper was torn, the thank yous sounded rehearsed. I never knew if it was about money, appearances, or simply control. But I understood one thing. My efforts were no longer welcome in the way they once were. The children themselves, as they grew older, didn't know how to bridge the gap that was being built for them. They were polite, always, but their schedules became busier, their weekends fuller, and my visits fewer. I didn't blame them. They were children, following the rhythm set by their parents. But I could feel their hesitation, the way they glanced at their mother when I asked if they wanted to come over. Their answer depended not on their desire, but on her permission. One time, my granddaughter whispered to me at the door, "Grandma, I want to come, but Mommy said we're busy." She looked down as she said it, and I understood she didn't want me to feel hurt. I patted her shoulder and said gently, "That's all right, sweetheart." But inside, I carried the weight of being quietly pushed out. It was never loud, never cruel in words. It was in the pauses, in the unspoken, in the delays. Invitations that used to come with certainty became vague suggestions. "We'll see how the week goes. Maybe next month. We'll let you know." They never said no directly, but the constant maybes built a wall higher than any outright refusal could. Because maybes carry hope, and hope stretched out long enough becomes a quiet kind of torment. I thought often of the years when my son was little, when I was the one arranging playdates, packing lunches, attending school concerts, and making sure he knew his family was present for every step. Back then, I couldn't have imagined a time when I would need to beg for a seat at the table. He used to run into my arms after school, smelling of crayons and playground dirt, and he would chatter about everything he saw. I gave him stability, consistency, a home where he was never an afterthought. And yet, as a grown man, it seemed I had become exactly that, an afterthought in his life, someone he turned to only if convenient. There was another moment, small on the surface, that revealed the truth to me. It was at a birthday party for my grandson. The house was full of noise, balloons tied to chairs, laughter bouncing off the walls. I arrived with a cake I had decorated myself, hours spent in the kitchen piping frosting just so. When I walked in, my daughter-in-law smiled politely and said, "Oh, we already have one." She pointed to a professionally made cake on the table, perfect and flawless. Mine was set aside. never even cut. I watched as the children blew out candles on the other cake, their faces glowing in the light, while mine sat untouched in the corner, its candles unlit. Later, when I left, I carried the half-melted frosting back to my car, telling myself it was fine, that the children had fun. But in truth, it was another message. My efforts were not needed. Over time, I started noticing the language they used when speaking about plans. It shifted from, "We'd love you to come to if you want to stop by," from "dinners at 6 to we'll let you know if it works out," and then, sometimes, no mention at all until after the fact. I would see photos online, family outings, dinners, trips to the park, that I hadn't even known about. Each image was a quiet reminder that I was no longer part of the default group. I was an optional addition, one they could edit out without explanation. The hardest part, perhaps, was the subtle rewriting of my role in the family. Once, I was the mother who was called for advice, the grandmother who was central to the children's lives. But now, I was gently recast as the older woman who means well but doesn't quite fit. I could hear it in the way my daughter-in-law spoke to me, always with a touch of distance, a formality that hadn't been there in the beginning. She called me Maureen more often than Mom, and though it was my name, the shift was clear. It created a boundary, a separation. My son rarely corrected it, perhaps not even noticing, but I noticed. Small changes in language carry great weight when you're the one being moved to the margins. One Thanksgiving stands out in my memory as the clearest sign. I had asked weeks in advance if I could bring my signature stuffing, the one my husband used to say no holiday was complete without. My son said, "We'll see. Let's check with her." Days passed before the answer came. She thinks it's better if she does all the cooking herself this year. I arrived empty-handed, sat at the table, and watched as every dish was served except mine. No one mentioned it, but I felt the absence like a missing limb. My husband's favourite was gone, and so was the piece of me that had been tied to it. The roots of distance are never obvious when they begin. They start as hairline cracks, tiny fractures that you convince yourself will heal. But with time, each crack widens until one day you look around and realize you're standing on the wrong side of a canyon. That morning, sitting in my quiet kitchen after that phone call, I saw the canyon clearly. The words had not come from nowhere. They had grown out of years of hesitation, dismissal, and quiet erasure. My exclusion had been practiced in small ways long before it was spoken aloud, and so I told myself the truth. I was no longer central to their lives. I was no longer the one they turned to, no longer the one who made things happen. I had been gently, steadily pushed to the edges, until one day, the push became a clear sentence. "It's just easier if you don't come." That morning, as the sun rose higher, I poured another cup of coffee and stared out the window at the street below. Neighbours walked their dogs, cars rolled past, life continued as if nothing had changed. But inside me, something had shifted. I knew that the distance wasn't accidental anymore. It had been built, brick by brick, until it became the foundation of how they lived without me. And now, I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The day of the dinner came quietly, like any other Saturday, but for me, every tick of the clock carried weight. I woke early, though I had nowhere to be. The morning sun spilled into my kitchen, warm and golden, yet it felt almost mocking. I sat with a piece of toast I didn't finish, sipping coffee that had gone cold before I reached the bottom of the cup. The hours stretched wide and heavy, each one reminding me of what I wasn't doing, what I wasn't allowed to do. By noon, I found myself pacing. My hands kept finding small tasks, folding towels that didn't need folding, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, Straightening books that no one else would notice were crooked. My body searched for a rhythm to fill the silence that came from not preparing to leave, not planning an outfit, not wrapping flowers. It was as if my entire being had grown used to the habit of participation, and now, stripped of it, I didn't know what to do with myself. Around 2 o'clock, I wandered into the living room and picked up the pie crust I had left in the freezer. I took it out, held it in my hands, then put it back again. It seemed pointless to bake something meant to be shared when there was no one here to share it with. The thought of eating it alone made me ache, so I left it untouched. Instead, I made a small bowl of soup and sat with it in front of the television, flipping through channels without settling on anything. No matter what program I landed on, it felt intrusive, like it was trying too hard to distract me. By late afternoon, I began to imagine the gathering itself. I saw the table being set, the children running through the house, the clinking of glasses, the smell of roasting meat filling the rooms. I could hear my son's laugh, the way it always rose above others. I imagined my grandchildren tugging at their mother's sleeve, asking when dinner would start, or telling her about something funny that happened at school. I pictured my chair, an ordinary wooden one, always placed near the end of the table, sitting empty. Perhaps no one noticed, or perhaps they noticed but said nothing, pretending it was normal. At 6 o'clock, the hour I should have been there, I sat by the window. Outside, families walked by in pairs or groups, carrying dishes or flowers, heading to dinners of their own. I watched them until the street grew quiet. I wondered if any of them knew what it felt like to be deliberately absent, to have been told that your presence made things harder. My phone buzzed once, a reminder I had set earlier in the week to leave for dinner. I stared at it until the screen went black, and then I turned the phone face down. As the evening unfolded, I kept glancing at the clock. 7, 8, 9. Each passing hour marked the progression of their gathering, and I followed it silently, as if watching shadows on the wall. I imagined the laughter rising, the plates being cleared, the children getting restless, the adults pouring another glass of wine. I wondered if my name came up, if someone asked, "Where's Grandma?" and if the answer was brushed aside with a quick, "She couldn't make it." That phrase, "she couldn't make it," would sound easier than the truth. It would protect them from admitting the words that had actually been said, that it was easier if I didn't come. I didn't cry. Instead, I sat with my tea, the second pot I had brewed that evening, and let the silence settle around me like a heavy coat. I didn't resist it. I thought, in a strange way, that maybe it was better to face the loneliness head-on, rather than keep pretending it didn't exist. I had been pretending for too long already. The next day brought confirmation of what I had imagined. When I turned my phone back on in the morning, there were photos on social media. My daughter-in-law had posted a picture of the table, a long spread of dishes, smiling faces, the children holding up glasses of juice like miniature adults. My son had his arm draped across the back of her chair, his grin wide. I studied the image longer than I should have. Every detail leapt out at me. The serving bowls I had once given them as a housewarming gift, the candle holders that used to belong to my mother, the table runner I had sewn myself years ago. My presence was there in objects, woven into the setting, yet I was absent from the scene. There were other pictures too. One of the children laughing with frosting smeared on their mouths. Another of the family gathered for a group shot, arms linked, faces pressed close. I stared at the space where I would have stood. It wasn't an empty gap. They had arranged themselves neatly, filling it without hesitation. It was as though the photo had never required me. That realization cut sharper than the initial phone call. Being excluded was one thing. Seeing them thrive without me was another. Later that afternoon, a neighbour stopped by as I was tending to the small plants on my windowsill. She leaned against the fence and said, "I saw your family yesterday. Looked like such a nice gathering." I forced a smile and said, "Yes, it was their dinner." She didn't ask why I hadn't been there. Perhaps she assumed I had chosen to stay home. Perhaps she didn't want to pry. But her casual observation confirmed what I had already seen. My absence was noted, but it raised no alarm. That week, I received a call from a cousin who had heard through someone else about the dinner. "Why weren't you there?" she asked. Her voice carried confusion, maybe even concern. I hesitated before answering. Then I said simply, "They told me it was easier if I didn't come." There was a pause on the line, a silence thick with discomfort. She finally murmured, "Oh, I see." And that was all. No defense, no outrage, just acknowledgement. It struck me how easily others accepted it, how quickly even family outside the circle adapted to the idea of me not being present. In the days that followed, I replayed everything in my head. I realized that this wasn't just about one dinner. It was about the message behind it, that I had moved from participant to spectator in my own family's story. I had once been central, and now I was peripheral. My absence was not accidental, and my presence was not essential. The dinner I did not attend became a symbol. It was the first clear moment when my exclusion wasn't hidden under vague excuses or soft words. It was direct, undeniable, and final. And as I sat in my house that evening, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, sipping tea alone, I understood that the gathering without me was more than just one night. It was the beginning of a new reality, one where I had to learn to live on the outside looking in. When the dinner was over and the photos had already made their way onto screens I hadn't been invited to share, I sat alone in my house and realized something simple but unshakable. I had to decide how I would move forward. No amount of replaying their words, no amount of reimagining the table with my chair missing, would change what had already happened. The only choice left was how I would carry myself after. And so I told myself, in the clearest terms I could manage, I would not beg. I would not ask. I would not press my way back into a place where my presence had been treated as a complication. The first real test of that decision came the following weekend. Saturday morning, I made myself a list of small errands: the post office, the market, the laundromat. Things I could easily have put off, but I wanted structure, a rhythm to keep me steady. As I walked through the market stalls, I found myself lingering at the flower stand. There were roses, carnations, lilies, all arranged in careful bunches. My habit was always to buy some as a gift for a dinner or visit. My hand almost reached for a bouquet out of instinct before I pulled it back. Instead, I bought a single bunch for myself, bright orange tulips, and placed them in the basket. When the seller asked, "Special occasion?" I answered simply, "No, just for the house." It felt odd at first, giving myself something I had always purchased for others. But as I carried them home, I felt a quiet shift. If I was not welcome at their table, then I would learn to make mine enough. That afternoon, my son called. His voice was light, conversational. He asked how I was, as if the previous week had been nothing but ordinary. I answered politely, giving him small details about the weather, the errands, the tulips. He didn't mention the dinner, and I didn't ask. There was a pause in the conversation where, once, I might have filled the silence with, "Next time, I'll come," or "Let me know if I can bring something." Instead, I waited. He cleared his throat and said, "We'll be busy for a while. I'll keep you posted." My reply was short. "All right. Take care." When I hung up, I sat for a long moment, realizing that my silence had been my choice, not his. That was my first act of quiet resistance, not chasing what was not freely offered. In the days that followed, I began shaping my routines differently. I stopped leaving my evenings half empty in case an invitation came. I filled them deliberately. Some nights, I read novels I had always meant to start. Other nights, I walked around the neighborhood, nodding to people I barely knew, enjoying the sound of my own footsteps echoing against the quiet pavement. I even enrolled in a painting class at the community center. The instructor, a woman in her 50s with streaks of blue in her hair, welcomed me warmly. She asked, "Have you painted before?" I laughed softly and said, "Not since grade school." She smiled. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." For 2 hours every Thursday, I lost myself in colors and brushes, in the mess of creating something with no one to judge it. The more I built this new rhythm, the clearer my decision became. I would not call to ask why I wasn't invited. I would not appear unannounced at their door. I would not spend another afternoon preparing food that would never be eaten. Instead, I would let the distance stand as it had been built. Not as a punishment, but as a boundary. My son and his family had drawn their line. I was simply choosing to stop crossing it. But decisions, even quiet ones, are not without their pangs. One evening, as I settled with a book, the phone rang again. This time, it was my granddaughter. Her small voice came through, bright and eager. "Grandma, we learned a song at school today." She sang a few lines, stumbling over the words, laughing at her own mistakes. My heart swelled and broke in the same breath. "That's wonderful," I told her. She asked, "When are you coming over?" For a moment, I wanted to say, "Soon." I wanted to promise her something, but I couldn't. Instead, I answered carefully, "We'll see when the time is right." She seemed satisfied, and the call ended. Afterward, I sat staring at the phone, my decision feeling both protective and punishing. Protective, because I refused to run after crumbs of attention. Punishing, because it meant withholding from myself the simple joy of saying yes. Another test came in the form of invitations, not from them, but from others. A friend from church asked if I wanted to join her family for Sunday dinner. My first instinct was to say no, to retreat into solitude, but I forced myself to accept. That Sunday, I sat at a table surrounded by people who weren't bound to me by blood, yet treated me with kindness. They passed me dishes, asked me about my week, laughed at my small stories. It wasn't my family, but it was warmth. And as I walked home later that night, I thought to myself that maybe family was not always about obligation, but about choice. Weeks turned into months, and I remained steady in my decision. Each time my son called, I kept the conversations light. I gave him news if he asked, answered questions politely, but never offered to come by, never asked when I could see them. If they wanted me, they would need to say it clearly. That became my line in the sand. I knew, of course, that this silence could be read as indifference, but I also knew that bending myself into constant availability had already cost me too much dignity. There were lonely moments. Yes, on holidays, when the air outside smelled of dinners being prepared and houses lit up with laughter, I felt the weight of absence heavier than ever. On birthdays, when the mailbox held no invitation, I reminded myself that my decision was still mine. And on quiet nights, when the house felt too large for one person, I forced myself to remember the tulips on the table, the brushstrokes drying on my canvas, the laughter of people who had chosen my company willingly. The most difficult moment came when a relative asked me directly, "Why don't you just go over there, knock on the door, and insist they let you in? You're the mother. You're the grandmother. You have that right." I looked at her and said quietly, "Rights don't matter when they've decided you're not welcome. Forcing my way in would only prove them correct, that I make things harder. I won't do that. She didn't argue further, but I could see in her eyes that she thought me stubborn. Perhaps I was, but stubbornness was the only way to keep my head high in the face of being sidelined. Through it all, I learned that a quiet decision doesn't need to be shouted to be firm. Mine was made not with confrontation, but with restraint. I would not push. I would not plead. If they wanted me there, they would have to say so. Until then, I would live my life on my terms, filling it with small rituals, new routines, and the knowledge that dignity sometimes looks like silence. The morning after that quiet dinner I had spent alone, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I made tea instead of coffee, craving something gentler, and carried the cup to the table by the window. The light outside was soft, grey with the promise of rain. When I turned on my phone, the screen lit up with missed calls and a message from my son. The words were simple. "Where were you last night? The kids asked about you." I read it twice, 3 times. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. The irony settled over me like a weight I couldn't ignore. They had told me not to come. They had said it would be easier without me. And now, after my absence, they asked where I was. It was as though I had failed a test, no matter how I answered. If I came, I was a complication. If I stayed away, I was neglectful. Around midday, the phone rang again. This time, I let it ring out. Then another call came in the evening. Finally, I answered. My son's voice filled the line, casual, but edged with something unspoken. "Mum, the kids were looking for you last night. They thought you'd be there?" I stayed quiet for a long moment before I answered. I wasn't invited. He hesitated. "That's not what I meant. You could have come." I reminded him softly. "She told me it was easier if I didn't." He exhaled, a long, frustrated sound. "You take things too literally." That sentence stung almost as much as the first one had. Too literally. As if my exclusion was a misunderstanding I had chosen to enforce on myself. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't corrected her, why he hadn't made it clear that his mother still had a place at the table. But I knew the answer already. His silence was his choice, and it spoke louder than any defense he could offer. After that call, I sat in the living room with the lamp casting a soft glow around me. I thought about the contradiction. Told not to come, then asked why I hadn't. It was a cycle I could never win. If I ignored their words, I was intrusive. If I respected them, I was absent. The trap was perfect in its cruelty because it made me the problem either way. And in that moment, clarity struck. The only way to escape that cycle was to refuse to play the game altogether. In the weeks that followed, their pattern continued. A text here, a call there, always vague, always careful not to mention the dinner again. Once, my daughter-in-law sent a photo of the children at a school play, their faces painted, smiling wide. "They wanted Grandma to see this," she wrote. I looked at the photo for a long time, my heart aching, but I didn't reply immediately. Hours later, I sent back. "They look wonderful. Thank you for sharing." Nothing more. I kept my words measured, polite, free of any plea for more. One Saturday, my son stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, holding a bag of groceries as though it were a shield. "I thought you might need these," he said. I thanked him, took the bag, and invited him in. He walked through the rooms, glancing at the flowers on the table, the canvas leaning against the wall, the books stacked by my chair. "You've been busy," he said. His tone carried something between surprise and unease, as though he hadn't expected me to build a life outside of waiting for them. I smiled faintly and answered, "I've been keeping myself occupied." He nodded, but said nothing more. When he left, I realized he had come not out of guilt, but out of curiosity, to see if I had folded in on myself without them. My steadiness unsettled him more than my sadness would have. Eventually, I knew I had to give myself closure. I couldn't linger forever in the half space between wanting them to call and refusing to chase them. So I wrote myself a truth. I took out a notebook one evening and put pen to paper. I will not wait for an invitation that does not come freely. I will not measure my worth by their convenience. I will not allow myself to be erased quietly. I will live as though my presence is enough, even if theirs does not confirm it. I read those words aloud in my empty kitchen, my voice steady. And for the first time in a long time, I believed myself. Not long after, another message arrived from my son. "Are you free Sunday? We might stop by." I looked at the text and smiled to myself. Might stop by. Even then, it was left hanging, uncertain, like a favor I should be grateful to receive. I set the phone down without replying. Instead, I pulled on my coat and went for a walk. The air was crisp, the evening quiet, and I felt the smallest spark of freedom. Because for once, I wasn't waiting. The more I leaned into that freedom, the more my life shifted. I began spending more time at the community centre, joining not only the painting class, but a book club. I met women near my age, each with her own story of being overlooked, forgotten, or dismissed. Around that table of paperbacks and coffee cups, we laughed, we argued about characters, we shared recipes. It wasn't family, but it was belonging. One evening, after a long discussion about a novel, one of the women touched my hand and said, "I'm glad you came into this group. You have a way of seeing things that matters." That sentence stayed with me longer than any apology I never received from my own family. Months passed, and my absence at family gatherings became less a shock and more a fact. Photos appeared online without me, dinners came and went, birthdays were marked without my chair at the table. And still, they would call now and then, asking why I wasn't there, as though the decision was mine alone. I stopped explaining. My silence became my answer. The conclusion I reached was simple, though not easy. Love does not mean submission. Family does not guarantee respect. And absence can be a form of dignity when presence has been twisted into a burden. I chose to live with that dignity. Now, when I look back at that first phone call, I no longer feel the same sting. I see it as the turning point, the moment I was forced to recognize what had been building all along. Their call the next day, asking where I was, no longer confuses me. It was not about missing me. It was about control, about expecting me to bend, to ignore their words and show up anyway, proving my loyalty in a way that would keep me small. I refused. And in refusing, I found a freedom I hadn't known I needed. These days, my home is filled with flowers I buy for myself, canvases half finished, books stacked high. I no longer leave my evenings open for an invitation. I fill them deliberately, with neighbours, with friends, with quiet solitude that feels chosen instead of imposed. When the phone rings, I answer if I wish. If not, I let it be. The story ends not with reconciliation, not with a dramatic apology or a tearful reunion, but with something quieter and, in its own way, stronger. It ends with me deciding that my worth is not dependent on anyone's convenience. It ends with me stepping out of the cycle of exclusion and contradiction. It ends with me living, fully, on my own terms. And when I think about those words now, it's just easier if you don't come. I no longer hear them as rejection. I hear them as the start of a sentence I was meant to finish myself. It's just easier if I don't come, because I have my own life to live.